Kansas Territory, May of 1872, the flames reached the sky like claws, hungry and bright. As Delaney Norwood watched everything she owned turn to ash, she stumbled backward through the tall grass, coughing from the smoke, her dress torn at the hem and blackened with soot. The cabin her father built with his own hands was gone. The barn, the smokehouse, the corral, all of it swallowed in fire. And behind her, the sound of hooves faded into the dark, cruel laughter trailing behind the settlers who had done it. They came at dusk. There were 6 of them, faces hidden beneath dust-covered hats, rifles slung over shoulders, whiskey on their breath. They said she did not belong. Said the land did not belong to women like her women who lived alone, who did not follow a man's word. They called her names, shoved her down, and set the fire while she screamed. She had no family left, no husband, no children, just the memory of her father and the land he gave his life for, and now it was gone. Night fell hard and fast. The prairie wind turned cold, biting at her arms. Delaney walked for hours, barefoot, skin scraped and bleeding from the stone and brush. She followed the riverbank, unsure where she was heading. She only knew she had to keep moving. When her legs gave out, she dropped beneath the cottonwoods, shivering. The moon had risen high, its silver light stretching over the water. She had nothing left, not a home, not a soul to turn to, and then she heard the whisper of leaves. A shadow moved between the trees, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in doeskin and silence. Her heart jumped. She scrambled to her feet, fists clenched. "Who's there?" she called out, voice hoarse. The man stepped into the moonlight. His face was calm, eyes steady, hair tied back with leather. He held no weapon, only a calm stillness that settled in her chest like warmth. "You are hurt," he said softly. Delaney backed away. "Do not come any closer." The man stopped where he stood. "I will not touch you." His words were simple, quiet, not a threat, not a demand. She studied him, his age not far from her own, maybe 30. His face was marked with faint scars and sun-darkened skin. His eyes held no cruelty, only knowing. "I saw the fire," he said. "From the ridge," Delaney swallowed, her throat burned. "They destroyed everything." He gave a short nod. "You are alone," she hesitated, then nodded once. He looked up at the moon, then back at her. "Come." "There is shelter." Delaney stared at him, her body trembling. She did not know this man, did not know his name or his tribe or why he would help her. But she had no strength left to walk farther, and in his voice there was no harm. He turned and began walking through the trees. Slowly she followed. They walked in silence for a long while. The woods grew thicker and then opened into a clearing where a small lean-to sat tucked beneath a rock ledge. A fire flickered low, banked beneath a circle of stones. "Sit," he said, motioning. She sank to the ground, her legs shaking. He handed her a folded blanket, worn but warm. She wrapped it around her shoulders, holding it tight. He lifted a pot from the fire and poured her a drink of warm water. She drank with both hands, the heat sliding down her throat like comfort. "My name is Bohdi Kestrel," he said at last, settling across from her. Delaney looked at him, her voice quiet. "Delaney Norwood," he nodded once. "You are safe here." She blinked hard, trying not to cry. "Thank you," he said nothing more. Just added more wood to the fire and sat with her, letting the silence stretch between them. When the moon climbed higher, she leaned back against the rock, her body too heavy to fight sleep. She woke before dawn, the blanket still wrapped around her, the fire still warm. Bohdi sat nearby, sharpening a blade, his hands smooth and practiced. Her voice was soft. "Why did you help me?" He did not look up. "Because they were wrong." Delaney watched him. "Do you live here alone?" "Yes." "Why?" He paused, then met her eyes. "Because the world is cruel." But not all of it. There was something fragile in her chest, something that had not stirred in a long time. She looked away, blinking fast. He stood and walked toward the woods. "There is a stream. You can wash." She followed him through the trees to a narrow creek. The water was cold and clear. He waited a distance away, giving her space. She scrubbed the blood from her arms, the soot from her face. When she returned, he handed her a strip of dried meat. "Eat," she did, quietly. For the next day and night, she stayed in the clearing. Bohdi spoke little, but his presence was steady. He hunted, brought her food, showed her how to wrap her feet. He never asked questions, never stared too long. On the third morning she looked at him as he cleaned a rabbit by the fire. "You do not ask what happened," he nodded. "Because I know." She looked at the fire. "They said I did not belong, said I should have sold the land, said I was too proud. You were not wrong to stay," her voice cracked, "but now I have nothing." He looked at her, long and quiet. "I will help you build again." She stared at him, heart thudding. "Why?" His voice was steady. "Because you are not nothing." The words hit something deep. She looked away, eyes burning. That night, after the fire burned low, she sat beside him, shoulder near his. He said, "The moon is strong tonight." She looked up. "It is beautiful." He turned toward her, his voice quieter now. "You are safe under it." Delaney breathed in, slow. "I feel safe with you." His eyes met hers. There was no rush in his gaze, only warmth, only truth. "I will not let the fire be the end of your story," he said. She reached out, fingers brushing his hand. He did not pull away. In the stillness between them, something began to bloom, not rushed, not spoken, but real. And as the wind moved through the trees, she leaned her head against his shoulder and he let her, under the moonlight. For the first time in a long time, Delaney did not feel alone. The rain came on the fourth evening, soft as breath through the cottonwoods. Delaney stood just outside the lean-to, watching the sky darken where it met the ridge. Bohdi returned near dusk with a brace of quail and the smell of wet earth clinging to his clothing. She moved to help him clean the birds, though her hands were still clumsy with unfamiliar tasks. "You've done this before?" she asked, easing the feathers from one wing. "Since I could walk," he said without looking up. She nodded, quiet for a moment, letting the rhythm of the work settle between them. The fire hissed as the rain began to fall in earnest, pattering against the rock and wood overhead. Bohdi spoke after a while. "There is a man I know south of here. He trades lumber and iron. I could speak with him." "What would I give him?" she asked, fingers pausing. "You don't have to trade everything with coin," he said. "Sometimes trust is enough." Delaney looked at him, unsure how to hold that kind of faith. "And he trusts you." "He owes my uncle a favor," Bohdi said. "That favor passes to me now." She didn't ask what happened to the uncle. Something in Bohdi's tone made it clear enough. When the birds were roasting over the fire, she sat back on her heels. "You said you live here alone, but you never said how long." "7 winters," he answered. "And before that," his jaw shifted slightly. "The war ended, but peace didn't come. My people scattered. Some went north. I stayed." Delaney watched him, shadows moving across his cheekbones. "Why here? Because it's mine." She understood that. Loss made you cling harder to what was left. He glanced at her. "You don't fear being here with me?" "I should," she said, "but I don't." He turned the quail on the spit, the firelight catching in his eyes. "My grandmother used to say, fear is a branch it bends, but it doesn't break unless you let it rot." Delaney smiled without meaning to. "She sounds wise." "She was sharper than flint," he said, "and twice as stubborn." They ate side by side, the rain easing to a mist. The meat was rich, and she hadn't tasted anything that real in weeks. Afterward, they sat with their backs against the stone, the fire warming their knees. Bohdi pulled something from a deerskin pouch, a folded scrap of paper, creased and worn. "Map," he said, unfolding it carefully. "These lines here Shawnee territory before the treaties cut it down." She leaned in to see, the parchment soft and faded. "That's east of here," he nodded. "My mother was born near the Ohio River, my father west of the Mississippi." "And you?" she asked. "I was born in a place that doesn't exist anymore." Delaney said nothing. She didn't have to. The silence between them had changed. It no longer carried the weight of strangers. That night she lay on a bed of pine boughs beside the fire. He slept a short distance away, his back to the opening, rifle nearby but untouched. She watched the slow rise of his breathing, the steadiness of it. Her body ached, but not from fear. For the first time it felt like the ache of healing. In the morning he showed her how to lay snares. She watched his hands work the willow cord, the precise tension he used to bend the branches. "Try," he said, stepping back. She hesitated, then mimicked his movements, fumbling at first. He didn't correct her, just waited. When the loop finally held, she let out a breath. "You learn fast," he said. "I had to," she replied. Later, they crossed the stream to a flat stretch of meadow where he pointed to a cluster of cedar and elm. "There's good ground here," he said, "high enough to stay dry. We could cut timber from that slope." She looked around, imagining walls rising from the grass. "You're serious." "I said I would help, and what do you get for it?" He met her eyes. "I get to see something built, not burned." Delaney turned away, blinking hard at the wind. "I don't know how to start again." "You already did," he said. They spent the rest of the day marking the four corners of a new cabin. He showed her how to notch the logs. Her arms shook with the weight of the axe, but she didn't stop. That night they ate beside a new fire under open sky. The lean-to stood behind them, but she didn't feel the need to hide in it anymore. "Your hands will blister," he said, glancing at her palms. "They already have." He handed her a small tin of bare fat and pine sap. "Rub this in," she obeyed, the balm cool on her skin. "I used to think I'd die on that farm," she said after a while. "Grow old alone like my father did." "You still might grow old," he said, "but not alone." She looked at him then, really looked. His voice had softened but held no promise he couldn't keep, just a truth spoken plain. "I don't know what's waiting ahead," she said. "Neither do I," he answered. She reached out, not in desperation, but in choice. Her fingers brushed his, slow and sure. He didn't move away. And in that small, wordless act, the ground beneath them shifted, steady and new. The days lengthened as spring deepened, grass rising green and thick across the prairie, clouds stretching low and full over the hills. Delaney woke early now, before the sun even touched the line of trees, her hands already reaching for the work waiting beyond the fire ring. Every task felt earned, each swing of the axe, each bundle of brush cleared. Bohdi had begun shaping the first timbers for the cabin walls. He worked in silence, but not coldness, just a kind of focus that asked nothing and gave everything. Sometimes she caught him watching the line of her shoulders as she lifted, or the steadiness in her grip as she tied and hauled. He never said anything about it, but when she passed him a tool, his fingers always brushed hers. One morning, as she gathered kindling by the creek, her boot caught on something in the undergrowth. She crouched and brushed aside the leaves to find an old rusted horseshoe, half buried in moss. She turned it over in her palm. "How long you think this has been here?" "Longer than either of us," Bohdi said, stepping beside her. "Think it belonged to someone who passed through?" "Maybe," he said, "or someone who never left." She studied the curve of iron. "Feels like a sign." Bohdi took it from her hands, ran a thumb over the worn edge. "Then we'll bury it beneath the doorway, for strength." That evening, as they fit the first beam into place, she slipped the horseshoe beneath the threshold stone. He watched her, and for the first time she saw the corners of his eyes crease with quiet pride. Later, while she sat on the half-built stoop, rolling sap twined between her fingers, Bohdi returned with a small sack over his shoulder and a hawk feather tucked behind his ear. He knelt and opened the sack, revealing a scattering of seed corn, beans, and a few wild squash. "There's a patch east of the ridge," he said. "Soil's soft there, water runs close. You want to plant?" she asked. "I want to stay." Her breath caught, but she nodded. "Then we'll plant." In the days that followed, they worked side by side, carving furrows with handmade tools, pressing seed into the warm soil. She found she liked the feel of dirt under her nails, the ache in her calves after a long row. It was the kind of tired that meant something. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the air turned golden, she caught sight of Bohdi standing at the edge of the field, his head tilted toward the wind. "You hear something?" she asked, brushing dust from her skirts. "No," he said. "Just the quiet." She joined him, letting the hush settle. The breeze stirred his hair, loosened from the leather cord at his nape. She reached out slowly and tucked a strand behind his ear. He didn't move. "You miss them?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "Every day." She let her hand fall. "I miss my father's voice sometimes." Not the words, just the sound of him moving around the house. Bohdi's voice was low. Grief doesn't leave, it just grows quieter, Delaney nodded. Like a creek running deep, he turned then, just enough to meet her gaze. You've changed since I first saw you, I've had to. No, he said. You chose to. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for his hand, not with fear but with clarity. He closed his fingers around hers, calloused and warm. That night they didn't sleep far apart. The fire burned low, the wind soft through the trees. She lay on her side, watching the curve of his shoulder, the way his chest rose and fell. He turned toward her, eyes open in the dark. You're not afraid anymore, he said, she whispered. No. He reached over, fingers grazing her jaw. Then stay, not because you have nowhere else, but because you want this. I do, she said, breath catching. I want this. He leaned in, and she met him halfway, slow, steady, certain. When their lips met, it wasn't heat that rushed in, but something quieter, something that steadied her bones. They fell asleep with their foreheads touching, a single blanket drawn across them both, the cabin rising just beyond, waiting to hold the life they were building. By late June, the earth had hardened under the sun, and the cabin stood shoulder-high, its walls straight and true. They worked without needing to speak often, the rhythm of their labor carving its own language. Delaney moved with a steadiness that surprised her, as though the soil itself had rooted her feet. Bohdi's presence was constant, not just in the way he lifted and carried, but in the way he noticed when her grip faltered, when her shoulders stiffened, when she needed to rest and would never say so. One evening, after the last beam was secured and the roofline traced the slope of the northern sky, she sat against the new wall and watched a Kestrel wheel over the field. Bohdi joined her, pulling a cloth from his pack and unwrapping 2 strips of smoked trout. I thought you didn't fish, she said, accepting a piece. I don't, he replied. I traded with the man who camps near the limestone bluff. He had more fish than sense and wanted salt more than pride. Delaney wiped her hands on her skirt. You speak of him like you've known him years. I met him yesterday, she chuckled, shaking her head. You're always finding someone. I listen, he said. It's different than looking. She leaned back, letting her shoulder brush the wood. Did you ever think about leaving this place? Going east, maybe, he took his time answering. Once. After the treaty lines shifted again and the traders stopped coming through our winter camp, I thought maybe it was time to start over somewhere no one would ask my name. What stopped you? My uncle's grave is here. And the wind tastes different in these trees. I couldn't forget that. Delaney looked down at her hands. A splinter lay just beneath the skin of her palm, catching light. I used to think leaving meant losing, but now I think staying's the harder choice. He turned his head toward her. You chose to stay. I didn't, not at first. I just didn't know where else to go. You know now, she nodded. This land knows me, even if I had to bleed into it first. A silence settled, but it was not empty. Bohdi shifted, resting his forearms on his knees. I've been thinking of building a smokehouse down by the old cottonwoods. There's stone under the soil there. It'll hold the heat better. That would work, she said. We could hang the squash in late August. He glanced sideways at her. You said we. She didn't look away. I meant it. That night, they slept inside the cabin for the first time, a bedroll spread across the packed dirt floor. The walls held the wind at bay, and the fire in the hearth crackled soft against the stone. As they lay beside each other, Bohdi reached for her hand and traced the curve of her fingers with his thumb. I used to think I'd disappear out here, he murmured. One day, no one would remember my name or where I stood. You're not disappearing, she whispered. You're building. He turned to face her fully, his breath warm in the hush between them. Then build with me, she pressed her forehead to his. I already am. Outside, the night moved slow across the prairie, stars wheeling in silence overhead. Inside, they held each other without fear, the air between them steady and full. In the morning, they rose early. There was more to do, shutters to hang, a stove to trade for, a well to deepen before the heat thickened. But when Delaney stepped outside and felt Bohdi's hand settle at the small of her back, she knew the hardest part was behind them. They had chosen each other. Not out of desperation, but from the kind of trust that only grows where fire once burned everything away. The first frost came early that year, brushing the still green leaves with silver and warning the soil of what was to come. Delaney stood barefoot in the doorway of their finished cabin, shawl wrapped close, watching steam rise from the clay pot she'd set beside the hearth. Inside, the floor was smoothed with packed earth, swept clean. The table Bohdi built from cedar planks stood beneath the window, its surface marked only by honest use: a dull knife, a folded cloth, a clay mug left from the night before. Bohdi returned from the bluff before sunrise, shoulders dusted with frost, 2 prairie hens slung over his back. He hung them on the hook beside the door and set his rifle against the wall without a word. His breath was steady, and when he stepped beside her, she leaned into his warmth without thinking. "We'll need to bring the squash in today," he said, voice low from the cold. She nodded. "And the beans should come down from the rack." "The longer they hang, the more the wind will take," he glanced at her hands. "You up for the ladder?" She flexed her fingers. "I'll manage." They worked through the morning, bundling what they could, tying the last rows of corn husks tight for drying. The cold made their hands slow, but the sun stayed out and the wind kept to itself. When the baskets were full, they carried them inside, laying them along the back wall beside the hearth. Afterward, they sat on the stoop, sharing a strip of dried apple Bohdi had traded for from a wagoner passing through the river bend. His coat was worn at the collar now, torn slightly where the stitching had come loose, but he didn't seem to notice. Delaney ran a thumb across the frayed edge. "You ought to let me fix this." Bohdi chewed, then nodded. "I forget sometimes. You see everything." She smiled softly. "I've had to." He took the last bite, then looked out across the field. "That traitor Elias is coming again before the river freezes." He asked if I knew anyone who could sew sturdy canvas. I told him I might. Delaney looked up at him. "You're giving away my time now." "I'm offering it," he said. "He's got a grindstone he doesn't need." She rested her head against his arm. "Then I suppose I'll be sewing." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and for a long while they sat like that, listening to the wind shift through the dry grass. Later, while she boiled the last of the squash, Bohdi laid out the grindstone and began sharpening the blade he'd used since spring. The scrape of metal against stone filled the cabin, steady and clean. Delaney stirred the pot, then turned toward him. "You thought you'd never belong anywhere again, didn't you?" she asked. He didn't pause. "I didn't think I'd be allowed to." She came closer, drying her hands on her apron. "And now," he looked up at her, eyes steady. "Now I don't leave unless you do." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "I don't mean to leave." He set the blade aside, stood, and reached for her hand. "Then it's settled." That night, they shared the stew at the table, the oil lamp burning low beside them. After the bowls were cleared, Delaney opened the cedar box beneath the bed frame. Inside was the shawl her mother had passed down, folded beside a single silver brooch. She hadn't worn either since the fire. Bohdi looked over as she fastened the clasp at her throat. "I'd like to be your wife," she said without ceremony. "Not someday, now." He crossed the room slowly, the firelight catching in his eyes. "Then you are." They stood in the quiet, hands joined. No one to witness it but the wind and fire and walls they'd built together. No need for more. The next morning she rose before him and stepped outside. The frost had deepened, turning the fields to white lace. She could see the fence line they'd finished last week, the smokehouse Bohdi had built near the cottonwoods. The garden rose sleeping beneath straw. He stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "We'll have to keep the fire going through the night now," he said. "I'll tend it," she replied. He pressed a kiss behind her ear. "We both will." They stood like that until the sun rose, golden and slow, breaking the frost into glitter, melting the chill from the air years past. The lean-to fell beneath snow and was never rebuilt. The cabin grew a second room. The squash grew longer each season. Neighbors came and went, though none stayed as long as they did. Some brought letters, and once, a boy with no kin who stayed through winter and called them his own by spring. They never spoke of the fire again, nor of the scars it left behind. They didn't need to. Their love was not loud, nor made of grand declarations. It was in the way he reached for her hand before sleep, in the way she laid his coat across the bed whenever the wind rose. In the life they built, not in spite of what had been taken, but because they dared to make something new. And every morning, without fail, he brought in wood for the fire, and she met him at the door, shawl tied, hands warm. They were never apart again.